The deputy had served papers before, but never on a house where the stove was still warm. He stood in the doorway with the rent notice damp in his fingers and watched two men lift the iron box off its bricks, the heat still ticking out of it into the cold room. A little girl sat on a trunk with a wrapped brick held to her chest, the last warm thing left. Her mother did not cry and did not argue. She folded a blanket as though folding it right still mattered. Then the girl looked up at the men carrying out the stove and asked, in a small, clear voice, whether the landlord owned the heat that was left in the walls too. The stove was still warm when Marit Rusk's men set it on the wagon, and Marit Brekke pressed her palm flat against the iron to hold the heat a moment longer. 11 miles later, the road gave out at the foot of a bluff, and that was where they left her, a widow, a coughing child, and a box stove strapped to a borrowed wagon beneath a wall of bare rock. Rusk had given her until sundown, 3 months of unpaid rent, he said, though her own account book showed 1. The territorial clerk who could settle the matter would not ride through for 2 weeks, and 2 weeks was longer than she had. She counted what stood between her family and the winter. $7. 3 1/4 cords of split wood, cut with her husband's hands before the belt took him in June. 1 stove with a cracked door. 8 years of a daughter who coughed in the dark. And 11 days she'd counted them twice. Before the first hard weather, the old freighter swore was already on the way. Leaving was not a door that opened. Passage on the railroad cost more than $7, and lodging at the far end of it cost more still. There was no cousin in Minnesota, no brother in Wisconsin, no name in a letter she could send that would send money back. The bluff was the only ground left to her, and the bluff was where she would either build or freeze. Eli sat on the wagon seat with a brick wrapped in a dish towel, holding it against her chest the way she had held it since morning. The brick had come off the stove top before the men lifted it. It was the last of the heat from the house they had lost, and the child had not put it down. "When it gets cold," Eli said, "do we go back?" "No," Marit said. "We stay." She did not tell her daughter that the brick would be cold before dark, or that the wagon was borrowed and had to be returned by morning, or that the man who had taken their house wanted her to come back on her knees. She lifted Eli down, set her against the sunny side of a boulder out of the wind, and began to unload. The parcel had been a sawmill once. She could read the ghost of it in the ground, a rectangle of packed earth where a building had stood, a rusted iron wheel half swallowed by grass, a heap of offcuts nobody had wanted. The mill had failed 2 winters back. The claim beneath it had reverted, unimproved, to whatever man was quickest to file. Marit had filed. It had cost her nothing but the walk to Yankton and the nerve to sign her own name where a husband's name was expected. She was still setting the last bundle down when Thomas Keene rode up the track on a gray mule. Keene was a carpenter, 56 years old, and the closest thing the settlement had to a fire warden. He had pulled 2 families out of shanties that came apart in high wind, and he had cut the door off a cabin where a block chimney had put a whole household to sleep and nearly kept them that way. He was not a cruel man, but he had seen what went wrong, and he had learned to say so before it did. He sat his mule and looked at the parcel for a long moment before he spoke. "You mean to winter here," he said. It was not a question. "I do." "With that?" He nodded at the stove. "With that?" Keene got down. He walked the ground the way a man walks a body. He has been asked to identify, slow, unwilling, thorough. He kicked the packed earth where the mill had stood. He towed the heap of offcuts and let a short curved board fall back onto the pile. He looked at her wood, stacked neat on the wagon under a canvas, and something in his face tightened. "You have 3 cords near enough," he said. 3 1/4. 3 1/4. He turned and pointed at the empty rectangle. "You have no roof, no foundation worth the name, no straight lumber that I can see. Those are boiler house scraps, curved and split, good for a fire and nothing else. What you have is enough dry timber to build one thing well, and you need two. He held up one finger, then a second. A room to keep the child, a shed to keep the wood. Build the room, and your fuel sits in the weather. Build the shed, and you sleep in the weather yourself. You cannot do both before the snow. No one could. The words landed the way she had feared they would, because they were true, and because she had already said them to herself in the dark of the wagon and found no answer. A claim shack, Keene went on, gentler now, is 12 by 16, framed walls, rafters, sheathing, shingles, or sod. A door hung true so it does not bind when the frost comes. A chimney set so it does not burn you out. Straight lumber for every piece of it. You have curved scrap and 11 days. I am not saying this to be hard with you, Mrs. Brekke. I am saying it so you go back to town while the road is still open. There is nothing in town for me, Marit said. There was a family, Keene said, and his voice changed under him. 2 winters gone. The man built quick, the way you mean to build quick, because the weather was coming and he had no time to do it right. Framed it light, skimped the bracing to save a day. The first true blow of January took the roof off in the dark and laid it down across the beds. He looked at his own hands. I dug the youngest of them out. She was 4 years old. I have carried out the ones who hurried, Mrs. Brekke, and I would rather stand here arguing with a living woman than dig a frozen one loose come spring. That is the whole of why I ride out here to be unwelcome. Marit heard it, and she believed him, and it did not change the ground beneath her feet. There is a roof. There is Rusk's roof. It comes with Rusk. Keene did not argue that. He knew Marit Rusk. Everyone did. He climbed back onto his mule, and before he rode off, he said the thing that stayed with her longest. The cold does not care that he wronged you, Keene said. It will kill you just the same. Then he was gone down the track, and the light was already going amber over the river, and she had until sundown. Rusk came at dusk, as she had known he would, riding a good horse and leading nothing, because he had come to offer and not to give. He was 48, heavy through the shoulders, a landlord who sold lumber in one season and firewood in the next, and made his best money in the months when men had no choice but to buy. He reined up at the edge of her parcel and looked down at the stove and the child and the woman as though he were pricing all three. You'll be froze inside a week, Rusk said. Then you'll walk back. So walk back now and save yourself the week. And do what? Marit said. Cook for my crews through the winter. There's a warm room off the kitchen. The girl stays fed. He let that sit. Against the debt, of course. You'd not owe me a cent by spring. I owe you 1 month, she said. Your book says 3. My book says 1. When the clerk comes, I will show him mine. Rusk smiled, and the smile was the worst part of him, because it was patient. Books can be read wrong, he said. Yours or mine. A clerk is a busy man. He signs what's easiest. He gathered his reins. That wood came off my ground. Off my ground, Mrs. Brekke. Cut on a house you rented for me. I could call it mine. You could try. I could. He turned the horse. Or you could keep it and freeze under it, and I'll buy it back off you in January when you've nothing else to sell. Either road brings you to the same door. Mine. He rode off without hurry, a man who did not need to hurry, and left her standing in the last light with everything she owned on a borrowed wagon. That night the frost came early. She built no fire. The stove was not set, the pipe was not up, and a fire under open sky was heat thrown at the stars. She and Eli slept in the wagon box under every blanket they owned, the child between her body and the sideboard, out of the wind. Toward the middle of the night, Marit woke to a sound she could not place. A slow, small ticking, water, dripping. She climbed out into the cold and found the canvas over her woodpile beaded and running. She had covered the wood tight against the frost, tucked the canvas down the sides and roped it fast the way any careful person would. She pulled a corner back and put her hand to the top row. It was damp, not from above. The frost had never touched it. It was damp from beneath the canvas itself, from the wood's own breath with nowhere to go, sealed under the cloth and turning the pile into something closer to a covered pot than a wood stack. The cover that kept the frost off had trapped the wet in. She stood in the dark with her wet hand and understood something she did not yet have words for. The wood needed shelter. The wood also needed to breathe. Wrap it against the weather, and it rotted itself. Leave it open, and the snow buried it. There had to be a third thing, a cover that shed the sky and let the air move, and she did not know its name. She looked from the woodpile to the stove, to the sleeping child. Keene had said it plainly, a room or a shed, not both. But the wood needed a roof, and the child needed a roof, and she had timber enough for one roof only. If a single roof could be made to do both, to close a warm room at one end and shelter breathing wood at the other, then Keene was wrong, and she could live. She did not know how to build such a thing. She only knew, standing there with the cold coming through her boots, that it was the one thing worth trying, and that she had 11 days to learn it. At first light, she went to the off-cut heap. Every straight board of any length had been carried off long ago, by the men who dismantled the mill, by settlers who scavenged after them, by Rusk, who took what he could sell. What remained was the refuse of refuse, short ends, split pieces, and near the bottom, a stack of long, curved timbers, bowed and cracked, thrown out from some old repair to a boiler house roof. Any carpenter would pass them. Keene had. They were bent where lumber wanted to be straight, and split where it wanted to be whole. Marit stood over them for a long time because the curve was doing something to her memory. She was a girl again in a boat shed on a Norwegian fjord, and her father was bending a thin rib of pine across his knee. She could smell the pitch warming near the shed stove and the wet wool steaming off his sleeves. He had let her hold the far end of the strip while he bent it, so the strain came alive in her own small hands, the wood fighting to spring straight and split, and he had told her in the old tongue that a single rib was a fool because it trusted only itself. One strip, he had shown her, snaps. He broke it over his knee to prove it, a clean, dry crack. But 3 strips, bound and set to the same curve. He had lashed them and stood on them with his whole weight, a grown man on 3 thin ribs, and they had held. A weak thing made strong by its shape and by the company of other weak things. She knelt and dragged 3 of the curved pieces out of the heap. She laid them across 2 flat stones so the curve arched up between. She overlapped the splits so that no 2 breaks met at the same place, the way her father had staggered the joins, though she did not yet know that was the reason it mattered. She lashed the 3 together with a length of rope. Then she stepped onto the crown of the arch. The timber settled. It did not break. She stood there with her heart going hard, a woman balanced on 3 cast-off boards, and she saw the whole thing at once, not the pieces, but the building. Not a flat roof that fought the weight of snow, but a curve that carried it, and not one roof for the room and another for the wood, but a single long arch, closed and warm at the back for herself and Eli, open and breathing at the front for the fuel. 1 shell, 2 needs. The thing Keene had said could not be done with the very scrap he had told her to burn. She got Eli, and together they set up a second arch beside the first, and a third, and she began to see how many she would need and how far apart they should stand. The plan built itself in her head as fast as she could catch it, 12 feet wide, ribs at every 2 feet. The back closed off for living, the front left open, the whole thing skinned in the rusted iron sheets she had seen further down the heap. Cheap, curved, strong. Eliza Weller found her in the middle of it. Eliza was a widow too, 37, with 2 sons and a cabin a half-mile down the bluff. She had walked over out of the neighborliness that women in that country still owed one another, and she stood watching Marit lash ribs with a look that was not unkind, but was not fooled either. "They said you were building a barrel," Eliza said. "I came to see if it was true." "It's a shelter. It's open at one end." Eliza pointed at the front bay. "You mean to keep wood there, in the open?" "So the air can move through it. Wet wood is half a fire. I need it dry." "You need it out of the snow." Eliza's voice sharpened because this was survival, and survival made her plain. "I cover mine, canvas, rope tight, against the north wall where the house breaks the wind. Snug. It comes through the winter fine. Mine came through last night wet under the canvas." "Then you roped it wrong." Eliza shook her head. "Marit, listen to a woman who has buried a husband and kept 2 boys warm without him. You have iron enough there to skin a real room, a room with 4 square walls and a rafter roof, big enough for you and the girl both, and you mean to spend half of it roofing a wood pile that a 2-cent tarp would cover. Build the room. Cover the wood. Don't build a barrel and pray the wind is kind, because the wind out here is never kind." It was the same verdict as Keene's from the other side of it, and Marit had no proof to answer it with, only the memory of a wet hand in the dark and a feeling she could not defend. "Let me show you a thing," she said. She stood a curved barrel stave up in the dirt, bowed toward the north, and behind it she poured a small mound of flour on a flat board. The wood, in miniature, sheltered behind the curve. Then she had Eli lean down and blow across the stave, hard, the way the wind would come off the bluff. The flour should have stayed behind the curve. It did not. Marit watched it lift and curl around the edge of the stave and settle in a fine dust exactly where the wood would sit, in the still air behind the shelter, in the pocket the curve itself had made. Eliza folded her arms. "There," she said, "your barrel invites the snow in the back door." And she was right. Marit had built the thing in her head as a curve that turned the wind away, and the flour had just shown her that a curve does not only turn wind, it makes a hollow behind itself, a quiet place where whatever the wind is carrying comes to rest. Snow would not blow past her open front. It would blow past and then settle inside it, in the lee, on her wood. She turned the stave so its open side faced away from the child's breath, and set 2 more staves at angles beside the opening like cupped hands. She had Eli blow again. This time most of the flour swept on past, but a smaller swirl still curled in around the angled edges and dusted the board. Better. Not solved. She had cut the problem down, but not out, and she did not know what would cut the rest. "You've made it less wrong," Eliza said, watching. "I'll grant you that. But less wrong is not right, and less wrong doesn't get you through a Dakota winter." She started back toward her cabin, then stopped. "I'll say one thing more, and take it kindly. If you fail out here, it's not only you that freezes, it's the girl. Build the sure thing." Then she too was gone, and Marit was left with a board of scattered flour and the knowledge that her whole idea rested on a swirl she had not yet learned to master. Keene came back that afternoon to see whether she had listened. She had not, and he could see it in the ribs standing on the ground. So you'll build the barrel, he said. I'll build the shelter. He looked at the arches, at the open front bay she meant to leave for wood, at the stove that would sit somewhere in the back near the curve of the iron. His mouth went flat. Then hear this and remember I said it, Keen told her. You are building a roof that wants to flatten and a doorway that invites the storm inside. That curve carries snow, I'll allow it. But a curve under load pushes out at the feet. It wants to spread, to lie down flat, and when it lies down on top of you. And that open front is a mouth. Wind will pour in it and pack it, and worse than that, you mean to set a stove near a pile of dry wood under one roof. One spark carried on a draft, and your whole winter's fuel goes up in a night, with the child beside it. He shook his head slowly. Snow trap or fire trap, you've built yourself a choice of 2 ways to die. Then help me build it so it does neither. I won't help you build a coffin, Keen said, and rode off, and this time he did not look back. She had until sundown to secure the scrap before someone else did, and someone else came. Rusk rode up while she was still sorting the good iron from the rusted through, and he saw at once what the curved timbers meant to her, because a man who sells things knows the look of someone who has found something valuable in a pile of trash. That's mill scrap, Rusk said, reverted with the claim. I'll give you 75 cents for the heap and clear the widow's rubbish before the county notices it's still here. It was a lie dressed as a favor, and they both knew it. The heap had come with her parcel. It was hers. But a lie repeated to a clerk could become a fact, and Rusk was a patient man with a book he was not afraid to write in. It's on my claim, Marit said. It's mine. For 75 cents it's mine, and no trouble to you. He held out 3 quarters in his gloved palm. She did the arithmetic she could not afford, and made herself do it anyway. If she let him talk the scrap into being his, she had no building. If she bought it clean, bought her own refuse back, in front of a witness, with a written line, key, then no book of his could take it. She had Eli fetch the freighter's boy who was watering horses at the river bend, and in front of him she paid Rusk not 75 cents but $4.20, counted out slow, for a clear bill of sale on every board and every sheet in the heap, written in her own hand and signed by his. Rusk signed it because $4.20 was more than 75, and because he believed she would freeze before spring and he would have it all back, and the money too. He did not understand that she had just spent more than half of everything she owned to make certain that the one thing standing between her child and the winter could never be called his. She watched him ride off with her money, and she looked down at what was left. $2.80 near enough, for nails, for a stovepipe collar, for hinges, for cart hire, for food, for a coughing child, for 11 days of work that had to end in a building or in a grave. Tell us in the comments, have you ever had someone dismiss your work before they understood what you were building? Because Marit was about to find out that the whole settlement had already made up its mind. By the next morning, the whole settlement had a name for it. It had started at the general store. Rusk had leaned on the counter with a plug of tobacco in his cheek and told the men around the stove that the Brekke widow was building herself an iron barrel out on the mill claim, and he had drawn the curve of it in the air with one thick finger so they could all see the foolishness of it. A stove set down next to a woodpile with a bent tin lid over the both of them, and a child inside. A man laughed so hard he had to set his coffee down. She'll pickle herself, he said, and that got repeated too. Rusk had drawn the shape and let the room fill in the rest, which is the cheapest and surest way to ruin a person, and the name traveled the way an easy joke travels, faster than the truth ever could. A widow, they said, out on the failed mill claim, building a barrel to live in, meant to set a stove next to a woodpile and call it a house, meant to winter under a curve of scrap tin with a child, when any fool could see there wasn't a straight wall in the whole contraption. A freight driver reined up on the road below the bluff to watch her lashing ribs, laughed, and told his partner she meant to live under a barrel like a jarred pickle. He said it loud enough to carry. Marit did not look up. She set her weight on the center of the rib she was testing and let it hold her, and said nothing, because there was no argument that a curve could win against a laugh. The gossip was not cruel exactly. It was worse than cruel. It was certain. The settlers could see no vertical wall, no proper roof, no door hung in a frame, and so they saw a woman who had lost her wits along with her husband. Some said the first hard gust would roll the whole shell down the bluff into the river. Some said she'd have set fire to herself by Christmas. Eliza, to her credit, told them all to hush and mind their own wood piles, but even Eliza did not say the barrel would work. Keene came a third time, not to survey now, but to press the one point he could not let go. "The fire," he said without dismounting. "I've been 3 nights on it, and I can't sleep for it. A stove and a season's wood under one roof and you a half-mile from any help. When it burns, and it will burn, they always burn. There's no one to hear the girl." And this time he was right in a way she could use, because a true fear points at its own answer. Marit did not argue. She took the plan in her head and split it down the middle. Between the warm back where the stove would stand and the open front where the wood would breathe, she would build a wall, a plank wall, coated thick with clay and lime wash, so that no spark could cross it. The wood would live cold on the far side of that wall, and each evening she would bring in only one night's fuel through a small hatch, an armload at a time, never the whole pile beside the flame. She told Keene this, and for the first time he did not ride away at once. He sat his mule a moment longer, chewing on it. "A clay wall between," he said. "That's not nothing." Then he shook it off. "It's still a barrel." But he had hesitated, and she had seen it, and she filed the hesitation away like a coin. Rusk's answer to all of it was quieter and more dangerous. The road up to the bluff crossed a corner of ground he leased, and one morning she found a rail fence thrown across it and a hired man standing at the gap who would not let her cart through. Without that road, the corrugated sheets could not reach the parcel, and without the sheets, the ribs were only a skeleton in the open air. She did not shout at the hired man. She paid the last of her cart money, 45 cents, to bring the load only as far as Rusk's boundary, and there, at the fence, she and Eli unloaded every sheet by hand. She lashed 2 poles into a low sled, and across the frozen ruts of the last quarter mile, they dragged the iron sheet by sheet, the mother in the traces, and the child pushing behind. Each sheet weighed near what a full-grain sack weighs, and there were 19 of them, and the number 19 became the whole size of the world. The frozen ruts caught the sled and stopped it dead, and each time it stopped, she leaned into the rope until her boots skated on the ice, and the cut in her palm woke and sang. Where the sled would not take a sheet, she carried it the last yards on her shoulder, the cold edge of it burning through her coat. Twice the river wind got under a sheet, the way a hand gets under a page, and nearly took it down into the ravine, and both times she went down on both knees in the ruts to hold it, and Eli threw her small body across the other end. She stopped counting the trip she had finished because that number climbed and climbing crushed her. She counted the sheets still at the fence instead because that number fell, and a falling number was the only kindness the day had to give. It took the whole short day. The settlers who passed on the road stopped laughing when they saw the girl in the harness. Laughing at a foolish widow was one thing. Watching a child haul roofing tin up a bluff because a grown man had fenced the road was another, and it sat wrong even with people who had no love for Marit Brekke. Elisa came out and carried 1 sheet quietly, and said nothing, and went home. Later Rusk sent word to her that anyone helping the Brekke woman might find their lumber account closed come spring, and Eliza, who owed on that account, did not come again for a while. Marit did not blame her. She had 2 sons of her own to keep warm. She worked on after dark because darkness cost nothing, and days were the only currency running out faster than her money. The cold sheet metal was the enemy she had not expected. Its edge caught the side of her hand where the glove had worn thin and opened a long, clean cut across the meat of her palm. She wrapped it in a strip torn from her petticoat and kept dragging because the sheet was not going to carry itself, and the sundown after this one was one day nearer the weather. That night she counted again, the way she counted everything now. 9 days, $2.35, 11 ribs to raise and a wall to build, and a wound in her right hand that made a fist feel like fire. She unwrapped the palm by the last of the light and did not like what she saw. The lips of the cut gone white and swollen, the middle of it angry, and she bound it again in a cleaner strip and told herself the cold would keep it honest. In the wagon, Eli coughed 3 times deep and went quiet, and the quiet was worse than the coughing because Marit lay awake in it waiting for the 4th cough to come, and she had not yet lifted a single arch into standing. In the morning she began to raise them, alone. She had reasoned it out on the ground the way you reason out anything you have never done, from first principles and hope. A raised rib had to be footed at both ends and pinned at the crown to the ribs before it, and then the whole run of them, tied together, would stand as one shell. She got the first rib up by main strength, wedged its feet against 2 stones, and held it with her shoulder while she drove a stake to brace it. It stood. She got the second up the same way and pinned it to the first with a cross piece near the crown, and for one bright moment there were 2 arches standing on the bluff, and the building was real. She let herself look at it for the space of 3 breaths. 2 curves of cast-off timber standing where a grown man had sworn nothing could stand, and the looking was the mistake, because it cost her the caution the work still needed. A raised rib is patient until it is not. It holds by the grace of the stone under its foot and the stake at its back, and both of those are only as honest as the ground, and the ground on the bluff was frozen a finger deep and soft beneath, where the low sun had been at it. She raised the 3rd, and when she set her hands to the 4th and heaved it up, the feet of the whole assembly began slowly to slide, not to break, to spread, just as Keen had said. The curve under its own weight pushed outward at the feet, and on the frozen slope the stones gave a little, and the 2 standing ribs leaned toward each other at the crown and away from each other at the base, the whole frame settling toward the ground like a thing lying down to sleep. She threw her weight against it. She jammed a stone under a sliding foot. It slowed, but it did not stop. She ran from foot to foot the way a person bails a boat that is filling faster than the bucket, empties it, wedging a stone here, throwing her shoulder there, and every place she pressed the frame gave somewhere else, because the trouble was not in any one foot, but in the shape itself, and a shape cannot be braced with bare hands. Her wrapped palm split its cloth against a rib and left a dark print on the wood. She understood, with a cold that went deeper than the air, that she did not know how to make it hold, that strength was not the missing thing, that there was a knowledge here she did not have, and that she had 8 days and a leaning skeleton and no one on the whole bluff who would help her. She was still braced against the frame, her cut hand slick inside its wrapping, when she realized she was not alone. An old man stood at the edge of the parcel, where the track came up. He had been there long enough to have watched the whole thing, the raising, the sliding, the failure. He was missing 2 fingers on the hand that hung at his side. He had watched her, earlier, test each sheet of iron for hidden cracks before she dragged it, and he had watched her sort the good timber from the bad, and something in the watching was not idle. He did not offer to help. He did not speak. He only looked at the leaning ribs and then at her, with the particular attention of a man measuring whether a thing is worth his while. Marit did not know his name. She did not know if he had come to help her or to wait, the way Rusk waited for her to fail so he could pick through what she left behind. She only knew the frame was still sliding under her hands, that the light was going, and that whoever this man was, he had seen exactly how close she was to losing everything. The old man watched the frame lie down, and then he walked over and did the last thing Marit expected. He did not lift a rib. He bent to the off-cut heap, drew out a straight board, sound, unsplit, the kind of board any builder would choose first, and held it up to her. "This one's stronger than your bent trash," he said. "Any fool can see it. Why'd you leave it in the pile?" Marit took the board. She turned it edge up and ran her thumb along the underside where the grain went soft and gray, and she showed him the fine trail of holes bored close under the surface where an insect had been at it long before the board was ever cut. "Because it's strong until it isn't," she said. "It'll hold a nail today and let it go in a thaw. My bent trash is honest. I know where it's weak because I can see where it's weak." The old man looked at the board and then at her for a long moment. Something settled in his face. Not warmth, not yet, but a kind of attention he had not been spending a moment before. "Absalom Pike," he said. "I built steamboats on this river for 30 years. Cabins, hulls, guards, decks. I know why your barrel fell down, and I know how to stand it up. 2 men in the county could have caught what you caught in that board without a tool, and I'm one of them." He held up the hand with the 2 missing fingers. "I don't work for charity, and I don't take it. You keep books? I keep books better than any man who ever cheated me on one." "Then you'll keep mine, and mend the coat I mean to freeze in this winter, and I'll teach you to make this thing stand. That's a trade, not a gift. You understand the difference? Most don't." He set the ruined board back on the heap, faced up so no one else would waste an hour on it. "We start now. You've light for 2 more hours and you've wasted 1. She had 8 days. He would not let her touch a rib until she understood why the last one failed. He took 3 of the curved pieces and laid them the way she had lashed them, and he pointed to where the splits and joins fell. "Look where your breaks are," Pike said. "Everyone meets its neighbor at the same place, right here at the shoulder, 3 weak spots stacked on top of each other. You didn't build 1 rib, you built a hinge, and then you stood on it, and it did what a hinge does." He pulled the pieces apart and reset them so that the join in the first layer fell a full hand's width from the join in the second, and that one a hand's width from the third. "Stagger them. No 2 breaks in the same place. Now, when this layer wants to fold, the layer over it is whole across the fold, and it won't let it. Weak wood, strong rib. It's the same trick your father knew, only he never told you the why of it." She had not told him about her father. She looked at him. "You bend a strip like you've done it before," Pike said, and said no more about it. They built the ribs the new way, staggered and clamped with rope while the bolts went in, and Marit drilled the holes herself with a brace, leaning her whole weight into the wound in her palm because Pike would not take the tool from her. "Change your grip," he said, when the pain made her slow. "Don't change who's holding it." By the end of the second day with Pike, there were 3 ribs built true. 3 done. 8 to go. 8 days gone to 7. The 4th rib was where the ground fought back. They raised it, footed it, pinned it, and the whole run began to spread at the feet, the same slow lying down she had seen alone, and her heart dropped, because if Pike could not stop it, then no one could. But Pike had been waiting for it. "There," he said, almost pleased. "Now you feel it. A curve carries the snow because it turns the load down its own belly, but everything it carries down, it shoves out sideways at the feet. Press the top and the bottom kicks. Your carpenter Keen was right about that much. The arch wants to spread and lie flat, and you have to tie its feet together so it can't. He showed her how. They dug the side sills down against buried stone so the feet had something to push against that would not move. They ran cross ties beneath the floor line, foot lashed to opposing foot, so that the outward kick of one side pulled against the other and canceled. And at the two end ribs, the ones with nothing beyond them to lean on, they buried timber dead men deep in the hillside and anchored the feet to them with wire and wedge. The frame stood, and this time when Marit set her weight against it, it pushed back. Keen rode up while they were tamping the last dead man and sat watching with his mouth pressed thin. "Sills and cross ties," he allowed. "That's more than I thought you had in you." Then, because he could not help it, "Wet ground under those anchors. First hard frost heaves the soil and lifts them, and your ties go slack in the night when you can't see it happen. You've bought yourself a week, not a winter." "Then I'll watch the anchors," Marit said. Keen grunted and rode off, and Pike watched him go. "He's not wrong," Pike said quietly. "He's just early. Mark that ground. Come the frost, you'll want to know if it lifts." That evening, Pike did a thing that looked like nothing. He cut a dozen lengths of wool yarn and tied them to stakes he drove in a ring around the parcel, and he made Marit sit with him in the cold and watch them. "Everybody thinks the wind comes from where it comes from," Pike said. "It doesn't. Not near the ground, not against a bluff. It comes off the top of that rock, and it curls." He pointed. Down low, near the base of the ledge, one of the wool threads was streaming backward, the wind at knee-height blowing the opposite way from the wind up high, curling in the shadow of the rock the way water curls behind a stone in a river. "Your southeast door faces away from the storm, and you thought that made it safe. But the storm hits that ledge and rolls, and comes back at your door along the ground. You built your mouth right where the wind turns around to come home." They spent most of the next day moving the whole frame 6 feet down the slope and turning it a few degrees, chasing the place where the wool threads lay quietest along the ground. It cost them a day they did not have. But when it was done, the door faced the still water instead of the eddy. 11 ribs built now, 7 standing, 4 on the ground, 6 days, $2.60. The iron nearly finished them. When they bent the first corrugated sheets down over the curve of the ribs, the metal cracked around its old nail holes, splitting from hole to edge like ice giving way. A gust caught a loose panel before they had it fastened and flung it, and the edge of it opened a red line across Pike's cheek. He put the back of his ruined hand to it and kept working. "Old holes are done holes," he said. "Everyone is a crack waiting for a reason." Marit found the reason to work around them. She punched fresh holes well back from the tired edges into sound metal, and under every nail head she set a small square of scrap tin, a washer cut with tin snips, to spread the pull so the nail would not tear through in a wind. Pike ran timber purlins the length of the shell, so the sheets caught the fasteners at more points and had less room to lift and drum. Where a sheet was split past saving, they lapped the good edge of the next one over it, shingle fashion, and let the damage hide underneath. Sheet over sheet, the shell began to close. Pike would not let her set the stove. "Not till there's a wall between the fire and the fuel," he said. "I have seen a woodshed take a spark off a stovepipe in a draft and light a winter's cutting in the time it takes to fetch a bucket. You'll not do that with the child asleep on the far side of it." So they built the partition Keen's fear had bought, a plank wall dividing the closed warm back from the open cold front, and they daubed the stove side with clay and lime until no spark could find wood through it. They set the stove on a bed of fieldstone. Pike shaped a tight metal collar where the pipe went through and left an honest gap of air between the hot pipe and any board that might char. High in the back wall, he cut a small vent, a hand's breadth, and Marit did not yet understand why a warm room needed a hole to the cold. She would understand it before the week was out. The front stayed open and cold, a bay for wood that could breathe. Then, with 2 days left, a squall came early to test them, and the test went badly. The roof shed the light snow well enough. It slid off the curve the way Pike promised. But the powder that did not land on the roof came around the open front and curled inside into the still air of the bay and dusted the first row of stacked wood white. Marit stood in the mouth of her own shelter and watched Eliza's every warning come true in miniature. Keene, who had come to check the anchors and stayed to be proven right, said the obvious. Board it up, close the front, and cut a little door. It's the only way. Then I fight a snowed-shut door every time I need a stick of wood, Marit said, and the wood can't breathe, and I'm back where I started with a canvas. Pike crouched in the bay and read the snow where it had settled. You did the hard part right, he said. You're standing in the wind shadow. Trouble is, a shadow's got a back eddy, same as that ledge. You made a quiet room, and the quiet's what pulls the snow in and sets it down. It's not blowing in, it's falling out of the swirl. And Marit remembered the flower on the board, and the way the little swirl had curled in past the barrel stave, no matter how she turned it, until she stopped trying to turn the wind and started giving it somewhere else to drop what it carried. She built 2 things in the last light. From the last of the straight board, she made angled cheeks that reached out from the sides of the opening like cupped hands, narrowing the mouth and breaking the curl before it could form. And well out to the northwest, upwind, where the storm would come from, she built a low porous fence. Willow, brush, broken slats, woven loose and raised a little off the ground. Not a wall to stop the wind, but a comb to make it drop its snow early, out there, in a drift of its own, before it ever reached the hut. Then she rebuilt the wood stack itself, the way the whole shelter had been arguing for all along. The bottom row went up on rails 10 inches off the frozen soil. She turned the split faces out to the moving air. She left gaps between the rows and a narrow aisle down the middle to walk and work. No canvas on the sides. Only the metal overhead. Wood housed like a thing that was meant to stay dry, not a thing being smothered dry. Rusk chose that day to come with 2 men and take it all back. He rode up with a paper of his own and a hard look and said the scrap iron had been sold off his managed ground without right, that the sale was void, that he'd have his men load every sheet back onto his wagon within the hour. Marit did not raise her voice. She took out the bill of sale, Pooh, $4.20, in her hand, signed in his toe, with Pike's name witnessed beneath it and the payment entered in her ledger under the date. She held it up where the 2 hired men could read it. Rusk reached for the paper. She put it inside the front of her dress and folded her arms over it and looked at him. And Thomas Keene, who had ridden out that morning only to watch her anchors fail, said the thing that surprised them both. The sale's good, Marit. I heard the boy witness it at the river. You take that iron and it's stealing, and I'll say so to the clerk. He did not say it kindly. He said it like a man who hated to be on her side of anything. But he said it. Rusk looked at the 4 faces around him and did the arithmetic a careful man does, and he turned his horse. Freeze under it, then, he said, and took his men away down the track. It was the first crack in the wall of him, and it was Keene, the doubter, the fire warden, the man who called her building a coffin, who had made it. The last day, the shell closed over the last rib. The partition plaster set gray and hardening. 3 1/4 cords stood under the metal, up off the ground, breathing. Marit had 40 cents left in the world. That night, the glass Pike carried in his coat, a little brass barometer off a wrecked steamboat, began to fall. He tapped it, and it fell further, and he did not say anything cheerful. "It's coming," he said. "Sooner than the freighters guessed. You'll sleep in it tonight, ready or not." They slept in it that night, the three of them, the first night inside the shell. After the sun went down, the metal began to speak. As the iron cooled, it contracted, and every few minutes it let go with a crack like a pistol fired far off, and Eli sat up rigid in the dark, certain the roof was splitting over their heads. "It's only the cold pulling on the tin," Marit told her. "It talks when it shrinks. Listen. It's not falling, it's settling in." To prove it, and to prove it to herself, she went out with a coal from the stove and marked the foot of each end arch with a line of charcoal on the buried sill, so that if a foot moved in the night, she would see it moved. In the morning she checked every mark. Not one had shifted. The talking tin had only been talking. She tested her wood then, the only way she had. She took 3 sticks, one from Eliza's canvas-covered stack down the bluff, one that had lain uncovered by the mill all week, and one from her own raised bay, and she weighed each in her hand and knocked each against a stone and held each to a match. The covered one was heavy and thudded dull and hissed at the flame before it caught. The uncovered one was rimed with frost and worse. Her own rang light and sharp against the stone and took the match almost at once. She had no instrument to put a number on it. She did not need one. Her hand and her ear told her what she had built the whole shelter to make true. Her wood was dry. Keen came a last time before the weather and walked the anchors he had promised would fail. He found them holding. He said so, grudging, and then he looked at the open front and shook his head. "Better than I thought. I'll grant the frame. But a real blizzard isn't a squall. It'll pack that front solid and bury the girl's fuel where you'll never dig it, and then the frame won't matter." He rode home to his own woodshed, which he had built the way he had always built them, hard against the wall with a good stout roof, and he did not know yet what that roof was about to do to him. Pike gave her his last warning at the door, quiet, so Eli would not hear. "Your brush fence will do just what I told it. The first drift will pile against it and grow, but watch it climb. When that drift gets as tall as the fence, the wind rides up over the top of it and starts a new one, right at your door. When you see the first drift near topping the fence, you raise the fence or you lose the door. Don't wait for morning to look. Snow does its worst work in the dark where you can't see it." Late that night, the telegraph down in Yankton took a warning off the wire, a hard fall of the glass, wind and cold and snow coming behind it. But there was no way to carry that warning 11 miles up a bluff in the dark, and Marit did not need it. Rusk found a way, though. A boy came up the track half frozen with a note. "Surrender the shelter and the fuel. Come to town. Take a warm room." Marit read it by the stove and fed it to the stove and watched Rusk's offer go up the chimney as heat, which was the only use she had for it. The first flakes came just before light. They came almost sideways, driven flat along the ground, and they came from a hair farther south than Pike had marked, a few degrees off, enough that the wind was reaching for the door instead of the still water beside it. Marit stood in the opening and felt the cold pour past her cheek toward the place where her child slept, and she understood that the storm had not read Pike's stakes, and that everything they had built was about to be asked a question no squall had asked it. The storm came out of the northwest, and then, as the great slow weight of it stalled over the territory, it veered and blew from the west, and the two winds together did exactly what Pike had said. The ledge and the fence would make them do, and one thing he had not. The brush fence caught the first of it. Out beyond the hut, a white ridge began to build against the loose weave, a drift growing where Marit had planted it to grow, 40 yards upwind, taking the snow the wind had meant for her door. That much worked, but the shell did not stand bare the way the cheap stories say an arched roof stands bare. Snow found the sheltered eastern quarter of the curve out of the scouring wind and clung there and began to build in a soft, uneven load along one side. Marit felt the difference before she saw it. A shell that had been ringing evenly in the wind now sang lower on the loaded side. She took a padded pole and went along the inside of the curve, knocking the snow loose from beneath before its weight could gather on one side and start the feet spreading again. She would do it a dozen times that day and more in the night. The roof shed snow, but only if she helped it, and no one had told her that, and no one could have. She learned it in the doing, with a pole, in the dark, while the wind screamed. The first night was the pipe. The wind drove the fine grains across the iron with a hiss that never stopped, a sound like sand poured on a drum, hour upon hour. The shell flexed in the gusts, a slow breathing bow, and somewhere on the windward side a nail worked loose, and its washer began to buzz. Pike and Marit crawled forward into the cold wood bay with a spare tie and a hammer, while Eli held the lantern behind the partition so its light would not blind them, and they cinched a brace across the loosening quarter until the buzzing stopped. Then the stove went sullen. A down gust rammed the chimney and shoved the smoke back into the room, and the flame in the box guttered and dimmed, and the good heat began to die. Marit found the trouble at the cap. Wind-packed frost building a collar of ice around the pipe's mouth, choking it. She shut the draft to starve the backflow, went out into the teeth of it to clear the cap from the sheltered side where a person could still stand, and came back and fed the box the driest, finest kindling she had until the flame climbed and steadied and pulled clean again. She would learn the rhythm of it over the days, when the wind slammed the pipe, close the draft, clear the cap, feed it dry, bring it back. Wet wood could not have done it. Wet wood would have smoldered and smoked and died, and taken the room's warmth with it. Near midnight, the entrance filled with two half-frozen shapes. Eliza Weller's boys had gone out to check the stock and lost the path between the house and the barn in the whiteout. The barn 30 feet from the door, an invisible and had followed the fence line the wrong way and fetched up, by luck, in the dark bulk of the bluff at Marit's shelter. Their coats were packed solid with driven snow, snow forced into every seam. And here the cold bay that everyone had called foolish did the thing no warm room could have done. Marit brought them into the breezeway, not the fire, and in that cold sheltered space, the snow packed into their clothes did not melt and soak them to the skin. She beat and brushed the snow out of them while it was still snow, stripped the frozen outer layers, and only then brought the boys through the hatch into the warm back to thaw, slow and safe. A warm entry would have melted the snow into their wool in an instant and left them wet and colder than before. The cold entry saved them, Eliza's own sons, warmed by the shelter Eliza had sworn would fail. By the second day, the drift had done what Pike promised. The brush fence was all but buried. The white ridge had climbed to the top of the weave, and now the wind was riding up over the crest of it and starting a second drift on the near side, a long tongue reaching toward the hut, exactly as Pike had warned in the dark at the door. Marit could not build a second fence in a full blizzard. A person could not stand out there long enough to weave one, so she did the rough, fast, brutal version. She drove stakes down through the top of the existing drift, wherever the snow was packed hard enough to hold one, and lashed to them rope and bundles of brush and the last 2 spare boards, raising the fence's fighting height by 2 feet in the only way the storm would allow. It shoved the new drift sideways, off the line to her door. But it put her out in the full force of it to do the work, and the driven ice cut her face raw, and by the time she crawled back inside, she had lost the feel of 2 fingers on her right hand and had to hold them to the stovepipe's warm shadow, a long while before they burned back to life. She had bought the door. But out across the bluff, Thomas Keene was losing everything he had been right about. Keene had built his woodshed the way he had always built them, a stout square roof set hard against the north wall of his cabin, a good roof, a proud roof. And the storm had shown him what a proud roof does. The sharp edge where his wall met his roof had thrown the wind into a spinning trap, and into that trap the storm had packed a drift as hard as poured concrete, and it had swallowed his woodpile whole. He and his son had gone at it with an axe to chop the buried logs free, and the axe handle had snapped in the cold, and the good square roof he had trusted had begun to groan under a load it was never curved to carry. If you are invested in Marit's fight, stay with us and subscribe. Because the roof has moved, the barrier is nearly buried, and the worst wind has not yet reached them. Then the emergency that changed the shape of the night. Keen's son had been feeding their failing fire the only wood they could reach, the wet, half-buried, frost-soaked logs from the edge of the drift, and wet wood does not burn. It smolders, and it had filled the little cabin with a slow poison of smoke. The boy came stumbling behind his father through the storm to Marit's door, confused and gray and sick, unable to walk a straight line and vomiting into the snow. Marit took one look and knew it for what it was because she had built her whole shelter around the difference between wood that burns clean and wood that smothers. She brought the boy through into the warm back and left Keene in the breezeway to shed his snow. She threw the stove open and fed it the driest, sharpest split she had, hot and clean, no smolder, and she reached up and pulled open the little high vent she had never understood the need for until this moment, because the room was full now. Herself, Eli, Eliza's 2 boys, Keen's 6th son, and Keene himself when he came through, 6 bodies breathing in a sealed warm shell, and 6 sets of lungs and 1 stove will foul the air of a small closed room faster than anyone expects. And the frost creeping around the rim of that high vent was the room telling her it needed to breathe. Keene saw her open the vent and let the precious warmth bleed out into the storm and objected, "Every instinct of a cold man is to close every hole." "You're letting the heat out," he said. "Close it." "Your son's sick from bad air already," Marit said. "I'll not make more of it in here. Warm and poisoned is worse than cool and clean." And she left the vent open and watched the boy's color come back and his eyes clear, and Keene watched it too and said nothing, which from Keene was a great deal. The worst came in the deep of that second night, and it came from below where no one was watching. A brace cracked in the dark, a sound like the metals talking, but deeper, wronger. The whole shell dropped less than an inch, but the charcoal mark at the eastern foot that had held true for 2 nights was suddenly a finger's width off its line. Pike was down on his belly in the wood bay with a lantern before Marit had the words out, and he found it. Melt water. Heat from the stove had thawed a little seep on the warm side, and it had run under one sill and out to the cold, and there refrozen into a wedge of ice. And the ice had lifted the anchor unevenly and let that foot begin to spread. Keen's frost heave come true, only it was her own stove's warmth that had made the water to do it. She had to reach the cross tie under the wood, which meant clearing a section of the bay, which meant carrying armload after armload of dry wood out into the driving storm where it would soak in minutes, spending the very dryness she had fought for to save the frame that kept it dry. She did it anyway, fast, stacking the moved wood under a lean of the eastern cheek where the wind's shadow was deepest, losing some to the snow and hating every stick of it. She got down to the shifted tie. There was no time to dig new dead men in frozen ground in the dark, so she took the wagon chain and a broken singletree from the sled, and rigged a short, brutal internal tie foot to foot, hauled it tight with a lever of the single tree, and pinned it. The spreading stopped. The charcoal mark moved no further. The arch held on a chain and a broken piece of harness because there was nothing else, and it held. Toward the tail of the storm, the wind swung back to the northwest, and for the first time came straight at the closed curve of the shell instead of the door. And here the shape earned its keep. The wind climbed the smooth back of the arch and accelerated over the crown and scoured the windward side nearly bare, carrying the snow up and over to drop it in a long, deep crescent beyond the fence and around the eastern flank. Away from the door, away from the wood, out where a solid wall would have caught and packed it. Some fine powder still made the breezeway, but it settled where Marit had built it to settle. In the open central aisle she swept clear again and again, not on the raised stacks to either side. The wood on the rails stayed off the ground and off the meltwater and free of bonded ice. Every armload she carried to the stove came apart in her hands, stick from stick, no axe, no chopping frozen logs free of a concrete drift, the way Keen and his boy had broken their handle trying. And each time a gust choked the pipe, the dry wood let her bring the fire back in minutes instead of losing it. At the first gray of the third dawn, the wind began to ease, and the hiss on the iron thinned, and inside the shell, 6 people were alive and warm and breathing clean air. Thomas Keen stood a long time in the breezeway looking at the raised stacks, at the aisle, at the dry wood off the ground, that his own buried, axe-breaking woodpile made a mockery of. Then he reached out and took a single split stick from the inner row, and he knocked it against another, and both of them heard it. That clean, light, sharp report that green wet wood cannot make. The sound of fuel that would burn hot and clean for whatever the winter still meant to throw at them. He did not say she had been right. Not yet. He turned the stick over in his hands and set it back exactly where it had come from on the raised row, and looked out at the drift lying just where she had told the wind to leave it. "Huh," Keen said. That was all. But Marit had survived the storm the whole county had been waiting to bury her under, and she had brought 5 other people through it alive, and the man who had called her shelter a coffin was standing in it holding a dry stick, and it was not even the middle of October. The hard winter had only begun. There would be months of it, but the barrel that everyone had laughed at was standing and dry and full and warm, and Marit Brekke stood in the door of it at dawn, her face cut raw and 2 fingers still numb, and understood for the first time that she was not going to die out here after all. She was going to become something the settlement did not yet have a name for. The storm blew itself out on the 4th day and left the world white and stunned and quiet. Eliza's boys went home to a mother who had spent 2 nights certain they were dead, and Keen carried his son back to a cabin full of stale smoke and a woodpile entombed in a drift he would spend a week chopping loose. Marit swept the aisle, marked her anchors, fed her fire, and did not let herself rest because the freighters had been right about one thing and wrong about another. The storm was over, but the hard winter was not, and there were 4 months of it still ahead. But the settlement had watched her shell stand, and after that nothing was the same. Keen came back first, and he did not come empty-handed. He rode up 3 days after the sky cleared with a carpenter's square and a plumb bob and a little notebook, and he asked stiffly if he might measure the frame. Marit let him. He worked for an hour in the cold, sighting down the ribs, dropping the plumb line at each foot, writing numbers. He found the eastern foot where the meltwater had heaved it, and he found the chain and single tree tie she had rigged in the dark, and he crouched over that rough repair a long time. "This held it," Keene said. It was half a question. It held it. A chain and a broke single tree. He shook his head, but the shake had changed. There was something like respect trying to get out from under the stubbornness. He stood, and he faced her, and he said the thing that cost him. "I was right about the thrust. I told you that curve would spread at the feet and try to lie flat, and it did. And it near went down in the night." He tapped the notebook against his leg. "But I was wrong about you. I said you didn't understand it. You understood it well enough to catch it in the dark with a wagon chain when a lesser builder would have slept through it and died. I was right about the arch, Mrs. Brekke. I was wrong about the woman under it. It was the truest kind of conversion because it validated them both. Keene's warning had been sound. Without it, she might never have buried the sills or watched the anchors. And her answer to the warning was what had saved her. He had not been a fool to doubt. She had not been a fool to try. He put out his hand, the calloused hand of a man who had built square and true for 30 years, and Marit shook it, her own palm still bound from the cut, and a doubter became something nearer, an ally. Eliza came next, and Eliza came to argue and stayed to learn. She marched up the bluff 2 days later, planted herself in the breezeway, and looked hard at the raised stacks, at the aisle, at the dry split wood standing off the ground with air moving through it. Then she said, because she was honest even when it hurt her, "Show me my mistake." Marit took her down the slope to Eliza's own woodpile, the one snugged against the north wall under tight canvas, and together they pulled the cover back. The top rows were fine. But the bottom third of the pile, the rows against the frozen ground, had wicked up the cold, and the ground zone damp and locked into a single frozen mass, log bonded to log with ice, the canvas that was meant to protect it having sealed the wet in exactly as Marit's had that first night in the wagon. Eliza put her hand on it. She could not pull a single log free without a bar. "It's not the snow that beat you," Marit said. "It's the ground and the cover together. The ground gives up its cold and its wet into the bottom of the pile, and the canvas won't let it breathe it back out, so it freezes into one thing. Raise the bottom row off the dirt. Cover the top so the snow slides. Leave the sides open so the air can carry the wet away. That's the whole of it. You don't need my barrel to do that. You could do it against your own wall tomorrow with 2 rails and a lean of tin." Eliza was quiet a long moment, her hand still flat on the frozen wall of her own good, careful, wrong-headed woodpile. "I told you to build the sure thing," she said. "You did." "I was the sure thing." Eliza almost laughed, and it came out closer to something else. "2 winters I've done it this way. 2 winters I've been chopping my own wood loose with a bar and thinking that was just the price of January." She straightened. Teach me the rails." After Eliza, they came in 1s and 2s, the way people come when they have watched a thing work and cannot quite believe it. Torsten Kavama walked over from his claim 2 miles east with his hat in his hands and asked in careful English how a man might do the raised stack against a sod house that had no wall to spare. Ragna Kavami came the following week and stayed the afternoon, and left with a drawing scratched on a shingle. A freighter named Wendell Tharp, who had laughed at the pickle jar joke in the store back in October, rode up in December and did not mention the joke, and asked instead whether the curved roof would work over a root cellar to keep the drift off the door. Marit did not remind him he had laughed. She answered his question, because the question was better than the joke. Not all of them came convinced. Embret Solheim, who had farmed the river bottom longer than most and buried a wife and 2 children doing it, rode up not to learn, but to correct her. He was past 60, hard and certain, and he sat his horse and told her the raised stack was a young fool's fashion. His own father had stacked wood on the bare ground in the old country and lived to 80, he said, and no daughter of a boatshed carpenter was going to tell him the ground had turned against him after all these years. Marit did not argue with him. Arguing with a man like Solheim only set the certainty harder. She walked him down the slope instead and had him put his own hard old hand on the bottom rows of Eliza's frozen pile, log welded to log with ground ice, and she said nothing at all. Solheim worked his jaw. He pulled at a log, and it would not come. He looked a long time at the ice-binding wood he could not free, and then he looked up the bluff at the raised stacks breathing in the wind, and he said gruffly that his father had stacked in a drier country, and that a man was a fool who couldn't learn a new ground at 60. He built the rails against his own barn the next week. He never thanked her, but he built the rails, and that was thanks enough. She would not let any of them build the whole shelter blind. That was the thing she held to hardest. She refused to hand a family a picture and send them off to copy her metal room because the room had a stove in it, and a stove near a curved metal shell wanted careful clearances and a partition and a vent, and a family that copied the shape without the reasons could burn themselves alive or smother in bad air. And then the barrel would have a name worse than a joke. So she taught the reasons, not the shape. She taught them to raise the first row of fuel off the ground. She taught them to cover the top and leave the sides to breathe, never to wrap a pile tight. She taught them to turn the opening of any shelter away from the wind that carried the snow and how to find that wind before they built, with a handful of wool threads on stakes, the way Pike had taught her, reading how the air curled off a bluff or a barn or a stand of trees. She taught them to look at what was already standing on their land, and to see where the existing walls and roofs had trapped drifts in hard-packed heaps, and to build where the wind ran clean instead. She taught them to give the drift a place to form, a low-brush fence upwind, so it would build there, out in the field, instead of against the door. And she taught them, over and over, to keep the season's wood away from the stove's sparks, because the winter that did not freeze you could still burn you. Most of all, she taught the flour. She would set a little curved barrel stave in the dirt, and a mound of flour behind it, and have the settler themselves blow across it and watch where the flour went, so that they learned in their own hands the lesson the storm had nearly taught her too late. That a curve makes a quiet pocket behind itself, and the quiet is where the snow comes to rest. Better to learn it from flour on a board than from a buried woodpile in February. Before long, it was Eli who ran the flour test for the visitors. The child had watched her mother do it a dozen times, and she had a steady way of setting the stave and pouring the little mound and telling a grown farmer to blow, and then pointing at where the flour had gone with the flat certainty of someone who had never doubted it would go there. Marit watched her daughter teach a man 3 times her size how the wind curls behind a curve, and she thought about the boat shed on the fjord and her own father's hands, and the way a thing worth knowing moves down through the hands of a family, whether the world is watching or not. Eli did not remember being cold in the wagon. She was growing up instead inside the answer to it. Marit Rusk watched all of this happen with the particular fear of a man who sells a thing in winter watching people learn to need less of it, because that was the true stake, and Rusk understood it before anyone. If a family with 3 cords learned to keep all 3 dry and burning clean, they needed no January wood from Rusk's yard at his January prices. If the whole settlement moved its fuel off the ground and learned to make a small pile last, then the leverage Rusk held every winter, the leverage of being the man with the dry wood when everyone else's had frozen into the earth, melted like the drift in a thaw. Marit's shelter had not just embarrassed him, it had reached into his ledger. So Rusk fought it the only way a landlord fights. He put out word that any tenant who built an improvised shed on ground he leased would be in violation of their lease and could be put off it. He dressed it up as safety. Fire hazard, he said. Eyesores, he said. But everyone knew what it was. And it was Keen, the fire warden himself, who cut the ground out from under him. Keen stood in the general store, in the same spot where Rusk had drawn the barrel in the air, and he said plainly that he had inspected the Brekke shelter with his own square and found it better anchored than half the frame shanties in the county, and that Marit Rusk had personally sold the lumber for a dozen lean-tos far more likely to burn than any raised wood stack, and had called them fine work when the money was in his hand. "You want to talk fire hazard, Marit," Keen said. "We can start with the sheds you sold." The store went quiet. Rusk had nothing to say to the one man in the county whose word on fire could not be bought, and the lease threat died where it stood. The winter ground on. And in the deep of it came the beat that told Marit she had truly won something, though it gave her no joy to win it. Rusk's own great house, the biggest in the settlement, with fireplaces in 4 rooms, began to run short. He had never learned what Marit had learned because he had never had to. He was the man who always had wood. His yard was stacked high, but it was stacked on the ground and under tight tarps, and the January drifts had packed around it, and the wet had wicked up into it and frozen it into a hill of ice-bonded logs, and his hired men were breaking their backs and their axe handles chopping his own fuel free faster than they could burn it. His housekeeper, an old woman named Brekke, who had kept his house since before his cruelty set hard, fell sick in a cold back room where the green wood would not throw enough heat. Rusk sent a laborer up the bluff to buy dry wood from Marit Brekke. Marit could have named any price. The whole settlement would have understood if she had. She did not. She refused the man's money, and she loaded a barrow with dry split wood off her own raised stack, and she sent it back down the hill, not to Rusk, she told the laborer, but to the sick woman in the cold room. "Tell him it's for Brekke," she said. "Tell him I said to burn it hot and clean and open a window while it burns." She would not sell Rusk his comfort, but she would not let an old woman freeze to make a point either, and the difference between those two things was the whole difference between Marit and the man who had thrown her out. Through all of it, Pike was at her side, and through all of it, he was failing. They worked well together that winter, better than teacher and pupil, as 2 builders who had each learned the other's hands. When the settlers began asking for shelters, it was Pike and Marit together who went out to build the first few. At the Kvamme place, the problem was that a sod house has no wall to lean a shed against and no spare timber to frame one, and Torsten Kvamme had almost given up on the idea. Pike solved it in an afternoon the way a river carpenter solves anything. He made the shed stand on its own. They set a short run of built-up ribs free of the house entirely, footed and cross-tied in the sod, a little arched shell of its own with the open mouth turned where the wool threads lay quietest. Ragna Kvamme fed them dinner out of a pot that had not had much in it lately, and Marit watched Pike show the Kvamme boy how to stagger a joint, patient and slow, the same lesson passing down another hand, and she thought that this was what the knowledge was for, whatever Pike said about eggs. The best of them, though, was the small curved woodshed they raised for Eliza against her own north wall, willow ribs and short boards, and the reusable tin off an old lean-to, a little arched roof exactly matched to the wind that Eliza's own barn threw across her yard. Eliza insisted on running the flour test herself before she would let them settle the angle, kneeling in the March mud blowing across a stave like a schoolgirl and finding the pocket and moving the opening a hand's breadth on her own judgment. Pike watched her do it and looked at Marit, and something passed between them that was close to pride. It was on those long-billed days that Pike told her the rest of himself, the way men tell things while their hands are busy and their eyes are on the work. He had built steamboats for 30 years on the Missouri, cabins and hulls and the great curved guards that carried the paddle wheels, and he had loved it the way a man loves the one thing he is good at. The two fingers had gone in a capstan, a line paid out wrong, a moment's carelessness that was not even his own. And after that, no boatyard wanted a carpenter who could not close his right hand around a plane. He had drifted down to sharpening tools and mending wagon boxes and sleeping in a freight shed, a river carpenter with no river, and he had been most of the way to giving up on being useful to anyone when a widow on a bluff had shown him an insect trail under a board that two younger men had missed. "You gave me back a winter of being worth something," Pike said once, not looking up from the rib he was faring. "Don't think I don't know it. I took your trade so I wouldn't have to say it plain, but I'll say it the once. You didn't need me as much as you let me believe. You'd have puzzled out the thrust in another day. I saw the way your mind ran." He set the plane down. "I let you think you needed me because I needed you to." They did not agree on everything. Their one real clash came over the teaching, and it cut deeper than either expected because it was about what the knowledge was for. Pike thought she gave it away too freely. "You spent a week learning what the flower teaches," he said. "You near died learning what the drift does over a fence, and you hand it to every settler who climbs the bluff for nothing but the asking. A man who gets a thing for free doesn't keep it. Charge them something, even a little, even in eggs, so they value it. That's how a trade survives." "And a family that can't spare the eggs freezes," Marit said. "So a lesson I already know can stay scarce. No, my father gave me the ribs for nothing. You gave me the wind for a mended coat. I'll give them the raise stack for the asking, because a thing that keeps children warm is not a thing to hoard." They argued it hard, the way people argue who respect each other, and neither fully gave in, and in the end Pike only said, "You're a better woman than the trade deserves," and let it lie. But she thought about it. She would think about it for years. By February, the cold had got into his hand for good. The old capstan injury, the two missing fingers, and the stiff scarred ones that remained seized in the deep freeze until he could not close them around a draw knife or hold a brace steady. He tried to hide it. She saw him fumble a chisel twice in one morning and pretend it was the cold on the tool and not the cold in him. He told her he was going south before the worst of his usefulness left him. "A teacher who stays past his teaching," Pike said, "hasn't taught a pupil. He's taught a habit. You don't need a man who can't hold a knife standing over your shoulder telling you what you already know. That's not help. That's leaning, and I won't be leaned on, and I won't be leaned on by proxy either." He was going to Sioux City, where a nephew had a warm room and a stove, and where a river carpenter could sit by a window and watch the ice break up in the spring one last time. A southbound freight sled was carrying him down before the March thaw made the roads impassable. He would not let her make it sad. On the morning the sled came, he handed her his tools, the brace he had drilled her ribs with, the awl, and the short curved rib he had used that first afternoon to show her the staggered joint. "You'll teach with this," he said, putting the little rib in her hands. "Show them what your father showed you. Tell them a single rib is a fool." He climbed onto the sled without help, refusing the hand she offered the way he refused all leaning, and he lifted his ruined hand once, and the sled pulled out down the track toward the river road. She stood in the mouth of the shelter he had helped her raise and listened to the sled go. The runners hissed on the crusted snow, a sound not unlike the storm's own hiss on the iron, and it grew smaller, and the curve of the shell caught the sound and held it a moment longer than the open air would have, so that she heard him leaving twice, once in the world and once in the echo off the tinning, and then not at all. The bluff was very quiet. The wind came off the rock the way he had taught her to read it, and there was no one beside her now to read it with, and for the first time she understood that everything he had given her was hers alone to carry, and that this was exactly what he had wanted, and that it was the loneliest gift a person could be handed. Share this story with someone who understands that preparation is not about owning the most. It is about protecting what you already have. She did not have long to grieve him, because the thaw that carried Pike south turned savage, and the hard winter's last cruelty was that it did not end in a melting, but in a flood. The snow that had been piling for 5 months went to water almost overnight when the warm wind came, and there was so much of it that the frozen ground could not drink a drop. It ran off the top in sheets, and every low place became a pond, and every draw became a creek. And Marit's shelter, sited so cleverly in the wind's shadow, sat below the great crescent drift the storm had built around her eastern flank. And when that drift began to melt, all its water came looking for the low ground where the hut stood. She woke one night to the sound she had learned to fear more than the wind, water moving where it should not be. The meltwater was running down off the buried drift field straight toward the living compartment. Her drainage trench, the one Pike had made her cut downhill in the fall, was plugged solid with ice that had not yet let go, and the water was backing up against it and spreading, and by lantern light she saw it reach the first course of foundation stone and begin to seep toward the floor. She was alone. Pike was 3 days gone down the river road. There was no one to tell her whether to tear up the wood platform and let the water run under, or to try to cut a new channel through ground still frozen a foot down. She stood in the cold, running dark, and made herself think the way he had taught her to think. Not what would he do, but what does the water want, and how do I give it somewhere to go? And the answer was in her own hands, in the short, curved rib Pike had left her. The curve carried a load down its own belly and out to the sides. Water was a load like any other. She did not need to stop the water. She needed to carry it around. She dragged out the short, curved offcuts she still had stacked, the twins of the ones her whole shelter was built from, and she laid them belly down in the mud in a line, overlapping like tiles, and made of them a little curved trough, a flume that took the meltwater at the high side of the living compartment and led it in a bright cold ribbon around the stone foundation and away down the slope past the far corner, where it could run harmless to the low field. For a moment she thought she had it. Then the water rose faster than the single flume could carry, found the gap where 2 boards did not quite meet, and spilled through, and in the space of a breath it was running under the foundation stone again and reaching for the floor where Eli slept. Marit went down on her knees in the icy mud and jammed her own coat into the gap to seal it, and the cold water soaked her to the shoulder, and she held the seam with her body while she thought. One flume was a trough. The water was more than one trough could hold. So she did what Pike would have told her to do, and what she now knew without being told, she gave it more channel. Where one flume was not enough, she laid a second beside it, and then a third below that, 3 curved troughs running side by side around the compartment, until the channels together could carry more water than the drift could send. The curved boards that had roofed her against the snow now channeled the flood around her floor, the same shape solving the opposite problem, and she understood as she worked that this was the thing Pike had truly given her. Not the trick of the arch, but the habit of asking what a shape could do. Eliza came up through the mud before dawn with her 2 boys and a shovel each, having seen Marit's lantern moving and known what it meant. And while Marit held the flumes, Eliza organized the boys and 2 neighbor men to attack the ice-plugged outlet downhill and break it open so the water had a mouth to leave by. By full light, the meltwater was running clean around the compartment and off the slope, and the wood on its raised rails had never touched it, while down the bluff 3 families who had built their sheds in the low, easy places were bailing soaked belongings out of the mud. And then, In the worst of the thaw, Marit Rusk did the thing his pride had sworn he would never do. His great house sat in a low bend, and his lumber yard sat lower still, and the flood that ran off the melting drifts was rising toward both, and Rusk did not know where to cut to save them. He rode up the bluff in the gray, wet morning, and he did not dismount, and it took him a while to get the words out. "Where do I cut?" Rusk said finally, "to move the water off the yard?" Marit looked at him a long moment. She could see the families down the slope who had heard the horse and come out to watch. The same tenants Rusk had threatened with eviction for building the very kind of shelter that had kept their wood dry. She was not a cruel woman, but she had learned something about ledgers from Marit Rusk and about who is made to ask and how. "I'll tell you where to cut," she said. "Get down off the horse and ask me in front of them." She nodded down the slope at the watching families. "The ones you were going to put off their land for building what I taught them. Ask me in front of them, and I'll tell you, and you'll have your yard." Rusk sat his horse. The water rose. And after a long, hard, silent moment, Marit Rusk got down into the mud, in front of the tenants he had bullied all winter, and asked a widow he had thrown out before the snows how to save his own ground. And she told him? A curved cut across the top of the yard to carry the runoff around it, the arch again, the same lesson. And he cut it where she said, and it held, and his lumber stayed dry. He had taken her judgment now in front of witnesses. He had come to her twice, once for the sick woman's warmth, and once for his own yard, and been given both. The whole settlement had seen the man who threw Marit Brekke out come up her bluff to beg her knowledge, but he had not admitted the one thing that mattered. He had not said a word about the rent. He had never confessed that he altered her account after her husband died, never returned to the disputed 3 months, never faced the ledger with the entries written in fresh ink over old dates. He would take her wisdom and use it, and never once own the wrong that had put her on the bluff in the first place. And the clerk who could settle it, the territorial clerk who had never yet ridden through, was due at last with the spring. Marit stood in the mouth of her shelter and watched Rusk ride his saved horse back down to his saved yard, and she knew the winter had made her something the settlement now came to for help, and that Pike's lessons had outlived his hands, and that her wood was dry, and her child was well, and the barrel they had all laughed at was the soundest structure on the bluff. And she knew, too, that none of it had yet answered the first wrong. Survival was not the same as justice. She had beaten the cold. She had not yet beaten the man. And the ledger that would decide it was riding toward Yankton on the first dry road of spring. The territorial clerk came at last on the first dry road of spring, a tired man on a tired horse with a satchel of other people's disputes, and Marit had been ready for him since October. She had kept everything. That was the habit her husband's trade had taught her, and her own careful hand had made permanent every transaction written down the day it happened, in ink with the date. She laid it out on the plank table in the warm compartment while the clerk drank the coffee she made him, her own account book, showing rent paid through 1 month and no further owed, the receipts her husband had kept, each one carrying the original account number the mill office had assigned him years back. And because the clerk was a man who trusted paper over people, she had asked the deputy to come. The deputy came. He was the same young man who had stood ashamed in her doorway the night Rusk's men carried out the stove, the one whose wagon her husband had once mended without taking a cent for it, and he had carried that shame all winter. He told the clerk plainly what he had seen, that he had served the eviction on a claim of 3 months' rent, and that he had thought at the time the figure looked wrong, and had said nothing because it was not his place. He said it was his place now. The clerk listened and wrote nothing, and for one bad moment he did the thing Marit had feared most. He rubbed his tired eyes and said that a written ledger was a written ledger, and that a dead man's receipts proved he had paid something, not that he had paid everything, and that he could not overturn a landlord's book on a widow's word and a deputy's late conscience. Marit felt the whole winter come back into her chest. The 11 days, the wagon, the frost on the child's blanket, because she saw how easily paper beats a person when the person is poor and the clerk is in a hurry. But she had not spent a season learning to read Marit Rusk, only to lose to him over a tired man's shortcut. "Then don't take my word," she said. "Take his. Send for his book. Hold his own 3 lines up to that window, and let his ink tell you the thing my mouth can't." Then the clerk sent for Rusk's book. Rusk brought it himself, because a man like Rusk believes his own paper will always beat a widow's. He set his ledger on the table beside hers, with the confidence of a man laying down a winning hand. And the clerk, who had settled 100 of these and knew exactly what to look for, turned the pages slowly under the window light and found the thing that Marit had known was there since the first cold night in the wagon. The ink. 3 months of back rent had been entered in Rusk's book, sure enough, but they had been entered in a darker ink than the lines above and below them, in a hand that had pressed a little harder over dates that fell after her husband's recorded payments. 3 charges written into the past by a man reaching backward to invent a debt. The clerk held the page to the light and tilted it, and the fresh ink caught differently than the old, the way a patch on a roof catches the light differently than the iron around it. He did not need to be a lawyer to read it. Anyone could read it. Rusk had read it himself once, and thought no one would ever hold it to a window. "These 3 lines are newer than the rest of the page, Mr. Rusk," the clerk said. It was not a question either. Rusk's face did the thing Marit had waited a whole winter to watch it do. The certainty went out of it. She did not gloat. She had learned from him how a ledger could be a weapon, and she did not want to become the thing that had nearly killed her. She let the paper speak, because paper does not need to raise its voice. The resolution was not a hanging or a jail cell, because the frontier settled most of its wrongs in the smaller currency of money and standing, and this one settled that way. Rusk withdrew the claim of debt. There was nothing else he could do with the ink caught in the light and the deputy's word and her own clean book against him. He paid back the value of the stove parts his men had carried off. He granted road access to the mill parcel in writing, the same road he had fenced against her cart, so that it could never be fenced again. And the settlement did the rest without any clerk's order. Thomas Keene, who had come to respect her over a wagon chain and a dry stick, let it be known that he would take no more construction work from Marit Rusk until every account in that book was set right and witnessed. And the tenants, the same families Rusk had bullied and threatened all winter, began quietly, one after another, to ask for written receipts when they paid him, and to keep them in ink with the date. That was the deepest wound to a man like Rusk. Not the money, the receipts. A whole settlement that had learned from a widow on a bluff to write things down. The change outlasted Rusk himself. Long after he had sold up and gone, the habit remained. On that stretch of the bluff, a handshake was still a handshake, but no one paid a landlord or a merchant without a slip of paper and a date on it, and the old-timers, asked why, would say it started with the Brekke woman and the winter Rusk tried to write a debt into the past. They did not always remember the shelter. They always remembered the receipts. The clerk finished his coffee, gathered his satchel of other people's troubles, and rode on. And Marit Brekke, who had come to the parcel 11 days ahead of a killing storm with $7 and a coughing child, held in her hand a written grant of road access to land that was, past any argument now, entirely her own. The winter that followed was the one that showed her what she had truly built, because the lesson had spread over the summer the way a good habit spreads, quietly, by hands, from neighbor to neighbor, and when the cold came again, the settlement met it differently. Marit and Eliza had turned the teaching into a kind of trade of their own by then, though not the kind Pike had meant when he told her to charge in eggs. In the weeks before winter, the two women went out together across the claims, a widow and a widow, and they inspected wood piles the way a doctor inspects a patient. They showed families where the ground was stealing their fuel. They repaired the sheet metal roofs that had lifted in the first winter's wind, adding the tin washers and the purlins Pike had taught. They kept, between the two households, a shared store of bone-dry emergency kindling, a barrel of it in Marit's breezeway and a barrel in Eliza's new arched shed, so that any family whose fire died in a storm could send a child to fetch dry starting wood and not sit poisoning themselves with green smoke the way Keen's boy nearly had. It was not a hypothetical kindness. The second winter, it saved the Ostrander family outright. Their fire went out in the black middle of a 3-day blow, a chimney choked with ice, their wood gone wet under a roof that leaked, and by the time the father understood the size of the trouble, the little ones had gone the dangerous kind of quiet. He could not have kept a fire lit on the wet wood he had. It would only have smothered them slow. But he knew about the barrels, because everyone knew about the barrels now, and he sent his oldest boy the half-mile through the whiteout to Eliza's shed with a grain sack. The boy came back with dry kindling that took the match on the first strike and a fire that climbed hot and clean. And the Ostranders came through the night because two widows had thought, in the calm of an autumn afternoon, to set aside dry wood against exactly that hour. Marit and Eliza argued about the barrels constantly, which was how they argued about everything. Eliza thought they ought to charge for the emergency kindling, enough at least to make people keep their own. Marit would not hear of it. A family that had to buy their kindling in a blizzard would sit and freeze before they'd spend the coin, she said, and pride would kill them faster than the cold. Eliza said Marit gave away too much and always had. Marit said Eliza counted too close and always had. They were both right, which was the whole reason the partnership held. Eliza's hard counting kept them from ruin, and Marit's open hand kept the settlement alive. And between the two of them, the fires stayed lit for miles. They did not take much for it. A meal, a mended tool, a day's help at harvest. Marit had won her argument with Pike in the only way that mattered, which was by proving that a thing given freely comes back around anyway, in the shape of a settlement that no longer let its people freeze. A typical morning that second autumn told the whole story. Torsten Kvama's boy, the one Pike had taught to stagger a joint, came up the bluff not to ask for help, but to bring it, to lend Marit a hand raising a shed for a family newly arrived from Wisconsin who did not yet know what a Dakota winter meant. The Wisconsin man had already started wrong. He had chosen the prettiest spot on his claim for his woodshed, a level place in the lee of a low rise, sheltered from the soft summer wind, and he could not understand why the two women frowned at it. Marit did not lecture him. She set a barrel stave in the dirt below the rise, poured a little flour behind it, and had his own small daughter blow across it, and they all watched the flour lift and curl and settle in a fine pale drift in the exact hollow where the man meant to stack his winter fuel. "That's where your shed wants to sit pretty," Marit said. "It's also where the snow will come to lie down all winter. The wind that's soft here in October is the wind that packs this hollow full in January. You dig your wood out of a drift every morning until spring." The man looked at the flour a long time. Then he looked at the bald, windy shoulder of the rise above it, the ugly, exposed place he had passed over without a thought. "Up there," Marit said, "where it's miserable to stand in a wind. That's where your fuel stays clear because the wind runs over it and drops nothing. Build ugly. Build where the wind runs clean. You can be comfortable in October or warm in January, and only a fool trades the second for the first. They raised his shed on the windy shoulder that afternoon, the Kwame boy staggering the joints the way Pike had taught him. When the first hard blow of that winter came, it laid its drift down in the pretty hollow exactly as the flower had promised, 40 feet from a woodpile that stayed clean and dry on the ugly rise. The man walked up the bluff in December to tell Marit she had saved him a winter of digging. She told him to go tell it, instead, to the next family that arrived not knowing, because that was how the thing traveled, hand to hand and mouth to mouth, and the traveling was the whole point of it. Ragna Kwame sent a drawing of her own improvement, a slatted panel that could be lifted out when the wind reversed in a thaw. Wendell Tharp, the freighter who had laughed in the store, now carried curved offcuts on his wagon, as a matter of course, salvage from every mill on his route, and sold them cheap to anyone building an arch, and made a small honest living doing it. Even Embret Solheim, who had never thanked her, sent word by a neighbor that his rails had held through a February blow that took his son-in-law's ground-stacked pile down to ice, and that a man was a fool who couldn't learn a new ground at 60, and that she could quote him on it if she liked. She did like. She quoted him often. The knowledge was no longer hers. It had become the settlement's, which was the only place knowledge is ever safe. Rusk's full reckoning came not in the clerk's visit, but a year later, and it came the way the deepest reckonings come, not from an enemy's hand, but from plain circumstance, from a man forced at last to see the size of what he had dismissed. It was a hard blow in the second winter, not the equal of the first, but bad enough. And Rusk's yard had frozen again despite everything, because Rusk was the one man in the county too proud to raise his own wood off the ground and take instruction from a widow. He had come up the bluff a third time. He did not ask for wood this time. He stood in the mouth of the shelter he had called an iron barrel, an older and grayer man than the one who had thrown her out, and he looked down the length of the breezeway at the raised stacks breathing in the cold, at the dry split wood that came apart in the hand, at the little high vent in the clay partition and the anchored feet, at the whole clever, cheap sound structure that had outlasted his contempt. He reached out, almost without meaning to, and put his hand flat against the clay-daubed partition, testing it the way a man tests work he is pricing, and Marit watched him do it, and understood that some part of Marit Rusk, the part that had sold lumber and knew good building from bad, could not stop itself from seeing at last that the thing was well made. He took his hand back as though the wall had burned it, and he did the arithmetic that men like Rusk always do out loud because they cannot help it. The shelter cost more than $7, Rusk said. Once every favor is counted. Pike's hands, Keene's word, the Weller woman's boys, every settler that dragged a sheet or lent a tool. It was a never $7. He said it as though it were an accusation, as though catching her in the true cost of the thing might take some of it back from her, might make her building a little less than it was. Marit looked at the man who had altered a dead man's account and fenced a road against a child in harness, and sent a note by a freezing boy telling her to surrender or come crawling to town. Then count every favor your warm house received, she said. Count the wood I sent Beret. Count the cut that saved your yard from the flood. Count the road you finally signed over because a clerk held your own ink to the light. Count all of it, Marit, honestly, in ink, with the dates. And then tell me which of us has been carried and which of us has done the carrying. Rusk had no ledger that would balance against that, and he knew it. And for the first time in the whole long story of him, he had nothing to say. He did not apologize. Men like Rusk do not apologize. The machinery for it was never built in them. But he took off his hat in the mouth of the iron barrel, which was as close to it as he would ever come, and he turned and went back down the bluff to his frozen yard and his ground-stacked wood. A man who had learned the lesson too late and too proud to build on it, and the settlement watched him go and understood at last which of them had won. That was the closest thing to justice the bluff would ever give her, and Marit found it was enough, because justice on the frontier was rarely a verdict. It was a man taking off his hat to a thing he had laughed at and walking home in the cold he had refused to learn. She never married again. The country was full of men who would have had a competent widow with a sound claim and a warm house, and one or two came up the bluff with that in mind, and she sent them off kindly because the partnership her life had settled into was already the truest one she needed. It was Eliza Weller. The two of them ran their winter preparation rounds together for years, a small standing enterprise that never had a name and never needed one. The two widows who kept the settlement's fires honest. Eliza handled the roofs and the heavy work with her grown sons. Marit handled the books and the reading of the wind and the teaching of the young ones. They argued constantly and trusted each other completely, which is the whole of a good partnership and more than most marriages manage. When Eliza's oldest boy married and built his own place, he built it with an arched shed already standing before the house, because he had grown up hauling dry wood out of one and could not imagine winter any other way. The years went by the way years go, in specific mornings rather than in summary. There was the winter the railroad finally came close enough that dry wood could be sold to the towns, and Marit and Eliza sold some and put the money by. There was the spring Eli turned 14 and could raise a rib alone and stagger a joint in her sleep and correct a grown man's wind reading without looking up from her work. There was the year Thomas Keene, who had called her shelter a coffin, built an arched woodshed of his own beside his rebuilt house, better made than hers, he was quick to say, with a proper square frame and true joints, because he could never help improving on a thing, and took to sending newcomers up the bluff to learn the wind from her before they built a board. The authority who had doubted her the longest became, in his stubborn way, her loudest advocate, and never once admitted the two things were connected. There was the letter that came one autumn from a nephew in Sioux City, telling Marit that Absalom Pike had died in his warm room by the window, in no pain, having watched the ice break up on the Missouri 3 springs running, and having told anyone who would listen about a widow on a Dakota bluff who had shown him an insect trail under a board and given an old river carpenter one more winter of being worth something. The nephew wrote that they had laid Pike out with a wood plane resting in his hands, the good tool of the trade the river had taken from him, and that he had gone easy in his sleep, talking of ice. Marit read the letter twice. Then she took the short, curved rib he had left her, the one he had used that first afternoon to teach her the staggered joint, the one he had told her to teach with Isori, and she hung it on a peg above the clay partition where it would stay, where a person coming in out of the cold would see it and ask what it was and be told. Eli asked her once, grown by then and sharp as her mother, why Marit had never tried to make the design properly hers, to name it, to sell the plans, to be known past the bluff for the thing she had made. They were sitting in the breezeway while the wind read itself across the wool threads. Marit still kept tied out of long habit. Marit thought about it a while before she answered, because the question deserved a true answer and not a modest one. A thing you name and sell, you have to guard, she said at last. You have to keep other people from using it, or the selling means nothing, and the whole worth of this was that anyone could use it. The day a family had to pay me, or ask my leave, before they raised their wood off the ground, it would stop keeping people warm and start keeping me comfortable, and those are different trades. I know which one your father would have wanted his wood cut for. She nodded out at the drift lying quiet, where she had long ago taught it to lie. I didn't build a thing to own, Eli. I built a habit to give away. You can't lose a thing you've given to everybody. People only ever lose what they try to keep for themselves. In time, she did what Pike had always known she would do once she could afford it. She built a proper cottage beside the shelter, squared timber, plumb walls, a real hung door, the conventional house Keene had said she could not build in 11 days, and could, it turned out, build at leisure across a prosperous decade. She moved the beds, and the table, and the living into it, but she did not tear the iron barrel down. She could not have any more than a person could tear down the room where they had decided to live. It became her woodshed and her workshop, the arch still standing, the ribs still staggered, the wood still raised and breathing beneath the patched tin, and it outlasted the arguments of everyone who had said it would roll down the bluff in the first hard gust. Every few years a sheet worked loose or rusted through, and Marit would climb up with Eli beside her, and later with Eli alone, and later still with Eli's own children steadying the ladder, and set a fresh patch of salvaged tin over the old wound, a tin washer under every new nail, the way Pike had shown her in the wind that first October. By the end, the shell was more patched than original, 5 colors of tin catching the light 5 different ways, and she loved it the more for the patching, the way a person loves a thing they have kept alive across a whole life with their own 2 hands. Variations of it spread across the nearby claims over the years, though never many, and never far, and never with her name attached the way a name gets attached to a real invention. Some were metal like hers, some were only boards or tarred cloth, or sod laid over bent willow ribs by families too poor for tin. What spread was not the shape, it was the habit underneath the shape, the raising of the wood, the covering of the top, the reading of the wind before a single nail went in. Marit Brekke was never remembered as the woman who invented anything. A newspaperman came out from the east one summer, years on, having heard some traveler's tale of a widow who had invented a metal house for $7, and he sat in her breezeway with a notebook waiting to write it down. Marit gave him coffee and gave him the truth instead, which disappointed him. She had invented nothing, she told him. The arch was as old as boats. Her own father had bent ribs like these on a fjord before she was born. Corrugated iron had been rolling off American mills since before her wedding. She had not made a single new thing. What she had done was learn, nearly too late and at a cost she did not care to describe to a stranger, to read where the wind put the snow, and then to teach it, so that reading the wind cost the next family nothing but an afternoon with a handful of flour. The newspaperman closed his notebook. There was no invention to headline, no patent, no lone genius, only a widow who insisted she had merely paid attention and taught others to do the same, and he rode back east with no story he knew how to sell. She was remembered on that stretch of the Missouri bluffs as the widow who taught you to test the wind with a handful of flour before you decided where to build. It was a smaller legacy than an invention. It was also a truer one, and it kept more people warm. She lived out her life near Yankton in the squared cottage with the iron barrel beside it, running her seasonal rounds with Eliza long after she needed the money, because the work was the thing she was for. In her later years, the young families she had taught as newlyweds brought their own children up the bluff to see the strange curved shed and hear the story, and she would set a barrel stave in the dirt and a mound of flour behind it, and have the smallest child blow across it and point at where the flour had gone, the way her own daughter had once done, the way her father had once taught her in a boat shed across an ocean. She did not tell them she had nearly died learning it. She told them the wind curls behind a curve, and the snow comes to rest in the quiet, and you must give the drift a place to form before it forms against your door. The bravest of the children always asked to blow across the flour a second time, and she always let them, because the second time was when they stopped watching her face and started watching the flour, and that was the moment a person learned anything worth keeping. Some of those children would raise sheds of their own one day, on claims she would never see, and turn their openings by a reading their own small hands had taken on her bluff, and never once think to credit the old woman who had made them blow flour off a board. She preferred it that way. A lesson you have to remember whose it was is only half a lesson. Then she sent them home to build. By the winter after the hard winter, 8 households along the bluff had raised their firewood off the ground and covered only the tops, leaving the sides to breathe. 4 of them built small arch shelters from bent ribs and salvaged tin, turned away from the northwest wind. The rest made do with ordinary lean-tos cited by the wool thread test, which was the part that mattered most. None of it carried Marit's name. All of it carried her lesson, which was that you study the land before you spend your last board on it. Marit Brekke lived the rest of her life on the Missouri bluffs near Yankton, in a squared timber cottage she built at her leisure, with the iron barrel standing beside it as a woodshed to the end. In her old age, she kept running the winter rounds with Eliza Weller, long past need, and she taught the flour test to a second generation of children who did not know the widow doing it had once come to that ground 11 days ahead of a storm with $7 and a sick child. When she died, she was buried near enough to the bluff that the wind she had spent her life learning to read still crossed her grave, and the arched shed she raised for that first winter was still standing, patched and leaning and full of dry wood. Years later, on a night when the cold came down hard and the snow drove sideways off the bluff the way it had the first October, Eli stood inside the original wood bay and listened to the storm. The metal had been patched in 5 places. The entrance had been narrowed by a dozen small repairs. Above the clay partition, on its peg, hung the short curved rib Absalom Pike had left, worn smooth now by years of hands pointing to it. Outside, the wind crossed the rock and rolled and laid down a long crescent drift exactly where her mother had learned, in blood and cold and near ruin, to expect it. Inside, the lower log stood clear of the frozen ground. The air moved between the rows. A narrow path ran back to the hatch, swept clean. Eli reached down and lifted one split stick and knocked it against another, and the sound rang out clean and sharp above the wind, the way dry wood rings and wet wood never can. Marit Rusk had stood in the store and called it Brekke's iron barrel, and the whole settlement had laughed. They had laughed because the shelter looked like a barrel. They had not understood that Marit was building around the wind.